An accident occurs in South Africa, where a boy falls unexpectedly from a tractor, and the huge tractor tire runs over his small and frail body. Moments of terror for his uncle Angus, who in desperation gets off the tractor and tries to get the boy to breathe again, but apparently his nephew is in very bad shape, since he does not stop spitting plasma from his mouth. Angus, powerless to see the boy lying on the ground in that state, and helplessly, launches a deafening scream that reverberates throughout the width of the farm. The child is quickly transferred to the hospital, where he is treated immediately.
Jesus, God, please.
This is one of the hardest and most painful experiences that Angus Buchan has had to go through, a farmer of Scottish origin, living with his family in Zambia, who some time ago was very worried and in a very bad mood. Seeing that he cannot fulfill his own promise to stay in that country despite the adversities, since business has not gone as it should, having to sacrifice animals and losing a lot of capital. For this reason the situation becomes unbearable for Angus, and his faith is already breaking, for not having educational opportunities for his 2 children and a 3rd child to come. All this desperation and despair have made Angus a very aggressive man, and he has a heated confrontation with a group of villagers in the village. In his eagerness to quickly leave that place, he sells the house below his real price, embarking on a trip to southern Africa with his family, taking only his old tractor. 6 months later, they arrive at their destination, an inhospitable land that is very difficult to cultivate due to the scarcity of water, having as their only refuge their small and old motor home, which from now on will be their home, and they will dedicate themselves to planting corn in their new farm called Shalom, which means peace. That is why Angus begins to work preparing the ground, for that he had to seek help, but he distrusted all the natives, and due to his bad character he began to treat them badly and dismiss them for any reason. But his concern grows even more, when he finds out on the news that many white farmers have been annihilated and robbed by the natives of that town, and he becomes aware of the risk that he and his family are running. But his wife, who is a faithful believer in God, knows perfectly well that he will take care of his family, even though Angus is skeptical and does not believe that his prayers could be heard. Days later, the farmer makes friends and they share a barbecue together, where they advise Angus to buy a weapon to protect himself from any aggression by a native towards him or his family. Very soon, Stained, the owner of the nearest farm, introduces him to a trusted villager named Simeon, who later along with Isaiah, helps Angus build his house, which upon completion by family decision they named it, the Buchan Mansion. After a few months, the new member of his family arrives in the world. Despite this, Angus's wife is very worried about her husband, who is very tense and tired lately because he has not been able to start production yet, while his friends suggest that he plant potatoes, but Angus thinks that it requires a lot of fertilizer and a lot of water, and in times of drought it would be almost impossible, and he prefers to plant corn. Days later, and as always, problems are never lacking. Angus's dream of a productive harvest recedes a little further, after some problems that Isaiah and Simeon present with the tractor, which made Angus very angry. But stress and exhaustion are taking their toll on Angus, who arrives remarkably exhausted at the village bar, where he meets his friends again. This attitude of Angus begins to affect his marriage, since he argues with his wife every day for any reason, even in front of the children. She is very worried about him, seeing that she can't let go of her worries. In search of a solution to help her husband, Gil decides to invite him to church. Although he refuses to attend, she finally manages to convince him. When they arrive at the church, he is a bit reluctant, but everything changes when he listens very carefully to the testimony of another farmer, who, like him, went through many difficulties and was able to overcome it with God's help. This moves him a lot and he feels identified, which makes him reflect on his faith, and decides to receive God in his heart.
I had nowhere to go to.
From that moment Angus changes his way of acting and becomes a man of faith, who listens to the voice of God that guides him and drives him to preach his word, while observing the miracles that are changing his life completely. One day, Angus sets fire to some dry logs, and this by accident is diverted, causing an uncontrolled fire in the crop. There, Angus begins to worry, and without knowing what to do, he has no choice but to test his faith. So he desperately prays to God that it rains to quench the fire, while Simeon and the other workers try to do it with their own strength. And then the unexpected happens. A rain miraculously appears, against all odds due to the drought, thus saving the farm's crops. After that experience, Angus's faith increased, so he built a children's home on his land, and contacted church pastors to support him in showing his life testimony. On a rainy night, Angus asks God to give life back to a young woman from the village, who has just died electrocuted by lightning, and before everyone's astonished gaze, she gradually recovered her breath, and in a few seconds a miracle occurs which soon became known throughout the world, multiplying rapidly among believers. All this made Angus increase his faith, so he was openly showing his faith, thus sharing his testimonies in different towns, taking God's message to the South African culture, thus forming part of it. So in no time, his following grew, and he quickly became well known in several nearby cities. Several months later, he arrives in his native country to preach, and upon his return, he reveals to all his workers and relatives that through prayer he reconsiders and decides to stay in Zulu, since he feels part of the tribe and wishes to be seen as one. As the drought was still continuing, Angus to ease the concern plans to hold a meeting of workers and farmers to pray for rain and violence at the city stadium, but was not given permission. The next day, August's faith is broken when he has a hard time riding the tractor around the farm with his daughter and nephew, who suddenly falls out of the vehicle and kills him. There, Angus does not know what to do, and the only thing left is to ask his brother for forgiveness. However, in the midst of sadness and guilt, Angus does not lose faith, despite the fact that people judge him for not using it with his nephew. But he has no choice but to take refuge in it to continue working the harvest, until, one night, his brother has a revealing dream, in which he sees his son very happy and running. That gives them peace and serenity after several days struck by the melancholy of the loss of the child. Meanwhile, Angus, with the support of Simeon, works hard with the potato fields. Many are concerned and suggest abandoning the harvest since the weather was not suitable for it to bear fruit, given the drought and the climatic phenomenon that affected them at that time. But faith and trust in God took hold of Angus, who stood firm before his decision to grow potatoes. After a few months, it is time to reap the fruits that until now no one believed had given results. Before checking, Angus summons all the workers at dawn to pray, and shortly after, in front of everyone's shocked gaze, Simeon pulls out a large potato from under the ground. No one could believe it, everyone was impressed. Quickly everyone learned about the miracle that had happened. A man harvested potatoes in the middle of the dry season. Shortly after, he was granted the football stadium that he had requested to pray for rain, and in the midst of thousands of people, Angus began to preach the word of God, demonstrating his power. This is the summary of a Christian movie based on true events called Faith Like Potatoes. Click here and do not miss the next story.